and stress effects. And I'm Karen Lombard. I'm with the New England Botanical Club, and I'll be moderating the session. Our first presentation is Horticultural Escape and Naturalization of Magnolia tripetala, north of its native range. We'll give the tree species a head start on climate change. And the authors are Bellemare, Claudia Deeg, Doug Sachs, and Regan, and Jesse will be giving the presentation.
All right, thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to talk this afternoon about an interesting example of horticultural escape with a very charismatic tree species that we're starting to see here in western Massachusetts, Magnolia tripetala. And this is a collaborative project between some students at Smith College, Claudia Deeg, and then also some colleagues at Brown University in the UK, looking at some of the more sort of complex climate models that are trying to predict how this is happening. So the big picture context for this work is thinking about sort of climate change and how biodiversity may respond to climate change in coming decades. It's generally recognized that climate change is going to be one of the top threats to biodiversity in the next century, in the coming decades, alongside things like invasive species, habitat destruction. Right up there, probably in the top 5, is climate change in most people's minds. And I think Elizabeth used a sort of a slightly different version of this figure that I have here from the Union of Concerned Scientists, but sort of a depiction of how climate might change in coming decades, based on a couple different scenarios, but basically placing Massachusetts with a climate somewhat like the Carolinas by the end of the century if sort of rates of CO2 emission continue at their present rates. So lots of change in store in terms of the climate, and the expectation is that it's going to have major impacts on the distributions of species, the performance of species around the world, as well as in the Northeast here. And there's thought to be a risk of widespread extinction due to these high rates of climate change that are likely to outstrip many species' natural migration capacity. So we know that species have moved around in the past in response to climate change. Climate has always been changing to some extent. We've come through ice ages. All the plant species that we have here in New England today are ones that migrated back here from areas to the south after the last ice age. So it's not entirely new that climate is changing. It's just that the rate of climate change we're seeing in the modern era appears to be substantially greater than anything that's happened in the recent geologic past. And so there's some concern that species migration abilities won't be able to sort of keep up with those new rates. And in that view, sort of in that view of how species respond to climate change, the expectation is that most species migrate to track their preferred climatic or environmental niche. There's definitely some evolution that microevolution takes place, species adapt to changing conditions, but at a broad scale over long periods of time, most species have migrated to follow their ecological niche as opposed to staying in place and evolving into some new thing. So dispersability is likely to be one of the decisive factors for many species determining how they respond to climate change and if they're able to keep up with climate change. And a number of studies have paired sort of the projected rates of climate change with what we know about species dispersal abilities. And in general, we're sort of looking at high rates of climate change, and for many species, evidence that rates of dispersal are quite low over long periods of time. And this has led to some very dire predictions. There was a famous study about 10 years ago now by Thomas et al. That projected that up to 18 to 35% of species might be committed to extinction by 2050. So this is talking about sort of millions of species here. These numbers have been debated back and forth in the last decade, but in general, people have converged on numbers in this range might be at risk of extinction due to substantial mismatches between where species live today and where the climatic conditions they're occupying now will be in the future. An example of that is this image here of the range of Fraxinus nigra. Its current range is sort of around the Great Lakes and into the Northeast. And some of these models have projected those conditions that it occupies today will have entirely shifted into Canada by the end of the century. And the only area here, you can barely probably see this from the back, but there's a little bit of green here, which is where the current native range overlaps with these future areas of apparently suitable habitat. So a complete shift from within the species' current range to where it might need to go in the future if its range is determined or controlled by climate. So some pretty severe scenarios here. And given these situations and the high rates of extinction that have been projected, a number of conservation biologists and ecologists have even proposed that we should intervene to assist species in migrating. So basically taking the slowpokes and maybe helping them to keep up with climate change if they're falling far enough behind that we expect that they might actually tip into extinction. Obviously, this runs sort of head-on into several decades worth of work on invasive species and biological invasions. And so there's been a fairly vigorous debate about this idea of assisted colonization, or what has been called managed relocation. So even as a hypothetical, at this point it really hasn't been done yet. There's been a lot of debate back and forth between a number of sort of well-known conservation biologists. Dan Simberloff is a sort of prominent opponent of this idea, as well as some other ecologists that have come out and sort of said this really might be necessary in the future, so let's start thinking about it. But again, primarily hypothetical. Some of the major concerns that have emerged around this idea of intentionally keeping species moved along with climate change can be grouped into four major areas. The one that most of us would think of immediately is this risk of invasiveness. If you're moving a species to some new area beyond its current native range, there's some expectation that some species might be released from ecological pressures and become problematic invasives. There's also some concern about sort of the ethics of relocating species and basically redirecting their evolutionary trajectory, moving them into some new environment with new soils, new day length, this sort of thing. So there's some philosophical concerns there. And then also some people sort of step back and say, why are we saving some species? These are sort of the losers of environmental change. Do we really need to intervene and risk creating new invasives if these species are sort of the losers of this time period? And then at the other end of things, people have also questioned whether this is a sort of a cop-out on climate change. So maybe we should be focusing our efforts on stopping climate change as opposed to adjusting to it or helping species adjust to it. So a lot of debate around this idea. And basically, mostly discussion and sort of theoretical considerations. But what I'm going to talk about today is this possibility that in the background, while this sort of philosophical debate is going on in conservation biology, maybe there are examples of what might be referred to as assisted colonization or assisted migration sort of already happening sort of in an unplanned, inadvertent way, and what can we sort of learn from those cases. And this idea came out a couple of years ago now with a European study that looked at native plant horticulture in Europe and asked sort of where are native species being grown within and beyond their native ranges. And this study found that in 73% of native species that were sold for horticultural purposes in Europe, the northern limit of their commercial range, where they were being sold, exceeded their natural range limit by on average about 1,000 kilometers. So this huge step forward in terms of where they were being sold and where their native range existed. So there's this possibility at least that many native plants, at least the ones that are aesthetically interesting or sort of pleasing, might have some ways of responding to climate change in a sort of undirected, unplanned way through horticulture. And what I'll be talking about this afternoon is whether some species are actually taking advantage of that potential sort of head start on climate change. So this is just looking at their presence in horticulture, and what we're asking here is whether some species are actually sort of escaping and naturalizing to take advantage of that head start they might be getting on climate change. And the case study that I'll focus on this afternoon is a new one from my lab here at Smith College, looking at umbrella magnolia, Magnolia tripetala, in western Massachusetts. This is a really distinctive tree, if anyone's seen it in horticulture or down south. Very distinctive, large, umbrella-like leaves. The leaves tend to be clustered out towards the tips of the branches so that you get this spray of very large leaves, 1 to 2 feet long, up to 3 feet long in some cases. Very tropical looking, doesn't look like it really belongs in the temperate zone. It's native to mesic deciduous forests in the southeastern United States, north to south central Pennsylvania. So its northern range edge is basically in southern Pennsylvania. This is a map of its native distribution drawn from the Biota of North America program. And in late summer and fall, one of the other distinctive features of the species is that it's sort of cone-like structures, reproductive structures, which are aggregations of follicles, turn this bright sort of pink color, and then the follicles dehisce and expose these sort of what look like little M&Ms or Reese's Pieces, which are fleshy coated seeds. Very distinctive, very striking fruit on this species. It's been in horticulture for quite some time now. Records suggest it was brought into the horticultural trade in the 1700s. Apparently the Bartrams were growing it in their gardens in Philadelphia. We found some records of it being sold in horticulture in the early 19th century through help from the Bailey Portorian's seed catalog collection. They tracked down a reference to this being sold in the early 1822 from a nursery on Long Island where it was being sold for 50 cents a tree. So it's been in the horticultural trade for a long time. It was sort of picked up by the early landscape gardening trade, and people cited it as one of the most desirable species for pleasure grounds in the 1840s and 50s. So it was picked up as a tree that was very dramatic and had a grand presence on estate gardens and lawns and this sort of thing. People refer to it as being a very good tree for June effects on the lawn. And the herbarium records that we've been able to track down support this fact that this species was in the horticultural trade and present in gardens in New England. We've found records in Rhode Island and Massachusetts in the mid and late 1800s, including some sort of fragmentary reproductive parts showing that it was flowering at least in Rhode Island in the mid 1800s. And by the turn of the century, Charles Sargent, the first director of the Arnold Arboretum, referred to this species as being often cultivated as an ornamental tree in the northern states. So it was apparently fairly widespread in horticulture. Again, a very dramatic species, very sort of charismatic species. And in western Massachusetts, where we've been working, we see sort of evidence of this horticultural place for this species in the 19th century. So a number of large trees are present in this area in western Massachusetts. This is a site in Deerfield, Massachusetts, with very large Magnolia tripetala here. Trees at Amherst College, Greenfield, Massachusetts, and then probably most dramatically, several very large specimens at Emily Dickinson's house in Amherst. So we've sort of seen that it's horticulturally present in the region, but very little evidence for escape and naturalization. And the first record of naturalization actually turns up in the 1970s, over 100 years after it was introduced into horticulture, in Amherst, Massachusetts. But then we start to see more records starting to turn up in the 1990s and early 2000s. The first record for Franklin County was collected by Robert Burton in 2012 in Irving, which appears to be the northernmost case of escape and naturalization by this species in eastern North America. So we've set out to look at these populations that are cases of adventive plants in western Massachusetts to figure out where these populations are, how extensive they are. Had help from a number of students going out in the field to look at the populations, core them. We found 8 adventive sites, including 5 with very extensive naturalization around western Massachusetts, multiple reproductive trees. And these new records substantially expand the known naturalization of the species in the east. This is a site in Deerfield with 100 individuals. And then here is a site in Amherst, one of the largest, with over 400 trees spreading through 2 or 3 hectares in forest there. Population structure, lots of seedlings in these populations in dark green, saplings, and then most of these populations have a few reproductive trees as well. And we've also done some coring to gauge when this escape and naturalization began. We've cored the 10 largest trees at each site. And across all 5 major sites where multiple individuals are present, we're finding that the largest trees, the most mature trees in these populations, fall in a narrow window of time about 21 to 25 years ago, so the late 80s, early 90s. And only 3 of the largest trees predated 1980. So these are some histograms of those populations. So it's been present in horticulture in western Massachusetts since the 1800s, but the naturalization began almost simultaneously in the late 1980s. And this is in spite of very different forest types that were invaded, as well as different timing of horticultural introduction. So in Amherst, it's been there since the 1800s. In Arcadia at East Hampton, it was planted in the 1960s, and yet both sites have escapes starting in the 1980s. And so we've inferred from this that this regional scale synchronization of escape and naturalization is probably something that's been triggered by climate change in the last couple of years. So, Prior to the 1980s, we were thinking that horticultural specimens of Magnolia tripetala in the north were planted beyond the environmental zone that was supporting recruitment and population growth. And it appears that warming climate has now caught up with these horticultural specimens and is releasing their reproductive potential and triggering these naturalizations, again, sort of simultaneously across the region in the last 2 or 3 decades. So due to its horticultural presence in the region, Magnolia has been able to rapidly respond to these newly suitable conditions as climate has warmed. And without the horticultural plantings, we would expect that natural migration from the 300 or 400 kilometers to the south where the species is native might have taken many decades or centuries. So the species has sort of immediately responded to warming climate, whereas natural migration might have taken much longer. And it appears to represent one of the first clear cases of inadvertent assisted colonization via horticulture. The species is now an element of the flora in western Massachusetts due to its presence in horticulture in the region. And this is a map showing sort of an updated map of this species distribution, its native range, as well as these adventive and naturalized populations in the northeast. All right, so with that I'll close up and maybe take 1 or 2 questions. Yeah, no, that's a great question, because where this is an inadvertent thing, and we're seeing these populations apparently coming from 1 or 2 individuals in a horticultural setting, there's probably been a major sort of genetic bottleneck as they've invaded these new sites. We haven't done any genetic work to actually trace them back to the horticultural trees, but in most cases, these adventive populations are sort of within a 100 or 200 meter area surrounding an old horticultural planting. So they're pretty clearly tied to these horticultural sites. But it's just in the last 20 or 30 years that they've actually started to escape and establish and spread through the forests in this area. Yeah?
In the next 50 years, from your sources, what is the projected rise in mean temperature or winter temperature, either Celsius or Fahrenheit?
Well, I think in the last 20 or 30 years, the Northeast has seen an uptick in temperature, and we're thinking that, at least looking backwards, that might be what has released the species.
No,
into the future, though, the projections vary in terms of the rate of climate change, but another couple degrees in the next couple decades.
Okay, and a couple of degrees Celsius that's going to shift the range of, I believe it was the ash, hundreds and hundreds of miles north.
Yeah, that's what.
Trust me, I certainly believe in global warming, but that seems a little bit far.
Yeah, that's one of the more extreme scenarios with the native trees. Others have more overlap, but it's those types of mismatches over the course of a century with anywhere from 3 to 5 degrees Celsius change that if species require the conditions they live under now, they would need to shift their ranges substantially north to stay within those climatic envelopes. It's sort of unknown whether some species might just stay in place and tolerate changed conditions, but if they are in some sort of equilibrium where they need those conditions, that's what's projected to happen for those species.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for.